and don't lick them. And the mice that are low-groomed, as they develop, tend to be deficient in certain cognitive tests and indeed show patterns of aggression, and interestingly, they pass these traits on to the next generation. Now, there's no difference in DNA, but what you can see from this diagram of Francois Champagne is a difference in methylation pattern of the DNA, which results in a change in the estrogen receptor promoter region in the brain. And it's not the only example. We now know that cortisol is also affected. Michael Meany has shown that women who have been deeply stressed at a certain stage in pregnancy have babies which are cognitively different on very striking, statistically provable analysis. So the field of epigenetics is very important, and it's going to grow in importance. My prediction, if I had one, which I won't, would be that we're going to hear more and more about epigenetics over the next 10 years. And in my view, those components mean a third kind of process: nature and nurture, but also development. Human development is going to be very, very important, both in the womb and afterwards. But the problem we have, of course, is that once we see something new, we're blown away. And look at this. This is work from my colleague at Imperial College, Michael Schneider. He's taken one of our embryonic stem cells, dosed it, and made it into a beating, living cardiomyocyte. It's impossible not to be impressed. In this room, 40% of us will have heart disease by the time we're 70, 80 or older, and will die of these diseases. The idea that in time we could manipulate cells like this, change perhaps their cell surface antigens, whatever it might be, change their genetics so that they can be transplanted and replace human muscle tissue, is a massive promise for the future. And it would be stupid not to say that that isn't worth doing. But it's also very dangerous to overhype the work. But it's also, I think, very difficult to be entirely objective about this kind of stem cell biology. That's our problem. Another issue, of course, is we live in a mathematically illiterate society. We don't teach maths very well in school. This really frightening headline from The Independent, in this case, 2.5 million men who are infertile in Britain. Wow. Let's look at that. Let's say there are 68 million people in England and Scotland. Let's say 29 million of them, half of them are likely to be male. Let's assume 10 million of them are not trying to have a child because they're under 20. I know there is such a thing as teenage pregnancy, but that's a fairly minority activity. Let's assume another 10 million are my age or thereabouts, or a bit younger, a bit older, and not trying to have children either, God forbid. That leaves 10 million males at risk. Let's assume half of those have female partners at the present time. Let's assume half of them are trying at the present time. That means that every single British man is infertile. You obviously get the point. And you see, the other issue, of course, is we're tending to treat science as certainty. This is a headline from The Sun a few years ago, the scandal that affected the National Health Service. We miss 1 in 5 cervical cancers. Look at the two smears. The top one shows a normal smear test, and the bottom one, clearly different, shows a cancerous smear test. The man on the top of the Clapham omnibus says, look, how ridiculous. Anybody can tell the difference between a cancer and not a cancer. How was it the laboratory missed this? These people who are being pilloried with their photographs on the right-hand side of the photograph. It's our fault that this has happened, because we talk about science as being the truth, as being about certainty. And actually, that is my problem with the approach that Richard Dawkins and his friends have. Now, Richard is, I promise you, a good friend of mine. I love his company. I think he's an amazing writer in English, much better than I am. But I think his approach is a very dangerous approach for science. To talk about science as the truth is, I think, a nonsense, because the more, for example, we understand physics, it's very clear the less we understand. All right, the universe is expanding. Where's it expanding into? If you are dealing with, for example, photons, it seems highly improbable how quantum doesn't become more and more puzzling as we gain knowledge of it. Here he is standing in front of a London bus saying there's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy life. Well, even that isn't scientifically valid, because the loose evidence from studies show that if you believe in God, you're rather less likely to worry anyway. So, in fact, he's wrong there, and I'm afraid so's Polly Toynbee and the delightfully pretty PhD student he's got around his arm. I don't know if she's a PhD student, actually. I don't even know her. But anyway. But think about it. This kind of certainty can go in places that we don't want to be. That's slightly more worrying, isn't it? Or maybe this. If Richard really thinks he's doing a public service by announcing that there is such a thing as the God delusion, then I think he's mistaken. The notion that we scientists have the right on our side to say anybody who doesn't believe in what we believe is deluded is wrong. Now, David Bellamy is in the audience, so it's quite interesting to say this in front of him. If he has a view that man-made climate change view needs to be challenged, then in my view he has every right to say that and to explain his view, because there is no truth in science. There are probabilities and views. And it's interesting, David, because I got an email from a PhD student just last week saying, I see that you're on a podium with David Bellamy next week. How dare you be on a podium with David Bellamy, who is, as you know, a climate change skeptic? And I said, well, as it happens, I don't share David's views about climate change, but I don't believe that not having a debate about climate change isn't extremely important for all of us. And that PhD student, actually, I must say, when I wrote back to him, apologized, which I thought was quite important, that he understood that actually, of course, we don't have truth on our side because we don't know where we're going, actually. It's true of oil, too. I mean, when you look at oil, this is Kilgore in East Texas, which started off with $2 a barrel of oil at the first gusher. Within a year, all these derricks were present, 2 cents a barrel. Water was $1 a barrel. This lovely letter saying, you know, look, our children are really suffering from the effects of oil in our villages. Can't you do something about it? Once he was king, he went out and bought this machine. I mean, we've learnt from a long time that the threat of oil might be quite catastrophic for all sorts of reasons, to do and not to do with climate change. So this is Russ County near East Kilgore, which of course was blown up as a result of leakage from the local oil wells. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is Fallujah, which over the last 100 years has seen not just the massacres that we've been responsible for, but repeated massacres over a century, and essentially for one reason. The commodity, of course, is oil. Let me just take, finally, one other technology. It's exactly 50 years since the laser was invented. When the laser was first imagined, can you really think that anybody believed you'd have rapid data transfer, or a CD machine, or barcoding, or be able to refine eye surgery remarkably, or gene sequencing with a gene sequencer, all of which depend on lasers? And of course now we're starting to use dual photon microscopes. Once we can get down to a nano level laser in photonics, we will be able to look inside individual molecules with a microscope. Because of course the smallest living organism is mycoplasma, I think, 2,000 nanometers, I think. Am I right about that? The DNA helix is about 2 nanometers.